All right, let's kick off another deep dive. And today, we're heading straight into some pretty fascinating election results.
Okay, sounds good.
Croatia, right in the heart of Europe. They just re-elected their president, Zoran Milanović. And, we've got a whole bunch of news articles and expert analysis here to really dig into what this all means.
Absolutely. And, this isn't your typical, oh, the incumbent won't situation.
Yeah, not at all.
It's a landslide.
Yeah.
For a leader who's not exactly shy about criticizing the EU and NATO, I mean, some are even comparing him to, Donald Trump.
That's what really caught my attention. I mean, you've got a president openly criticizing these big institutions, and then he wins by a huge margin. What's going on here?
Right. It seems counterintuitive, but trust me, there's a whole lot more to this story.
Okay, so walk me through this.
Well, first, you got to understand the Croatian presidency. It's largely ceremonial.
Okay.
But, and this is key, it still has a lot of sway when it comes to foreign policy, military decisions.
Yeah. So even though he can't directly change laws or domestic stuff,
right,
his stance on the EU and NATO still matters.
Big time. It can really impact how Croatia positions itself on the world stage.
Okay, so the president's not just a figurehead.
Not at all.
But still, why would voters choose someone who seems to be, at odds with these organizations?
Yeah, and that's where understanding Croatian politics and public opinion becomes crucial. You see, it's not just about agreeing or disagreeing with the EU or NATO. It's about what these organizations represent to different people.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What are some of those different perspectives?
Well, for some, the EU might be like the golden ticket.
Right.
Economic opportunity, stability, a chance to be part of something bigger.
Yeah,
right?
Makes sense.
But for others, it might feel like this big bureaucratic machine dictating rules from far away, maybe even undermining Croatian sovereignty.
So it's this tension between the benefits of being part of these larger entities, but also wanting to maintain your own national identity.
Exactly.
And control your own decisions.
Right. And don't forget, Croatia's a relatively young democracy.
Oh, that's true.
Joined the EU back in 2013. So some citizens might feel like, hey, where are all those promised benefits?
Right.
While others are maybe wary of giving up too much control to Brussels.
Okay, so where does Milanović fit into all of this?
He's really positioned himself as this champion of Croatian interests, Someone who's not afraid to stand up to to NATO.
Yeah.
Demanding a better deal for his country.
Okay, and that clearly resonates with some voters.
Big time. Especially those who feel disillusioned, like their voices aren't being heard by the establishment.
So even though he's critical, it doesn't necessarily mean he wants Croatia to leave the EU or NATO.
Right. It's more about using his platform to push for reforms.
Right.
And assert Croatian independence within those structures.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying, hey, we're at the table, but we're not afraid to speak our minds.
Exactly. He's playing the populist card and judging by his victory.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that landslide.
Yeah.
74% of the vote.
Incredible.
It's a pretty clear message, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A resounding mandate. I mean, he crushed the ruling party's candidate.
Yeah.
Dragan Primorac, almost 3-1.
Wow.
This wasn't just a win for Milanović. It was a major blow to Prime Minister Plenković and his HDZ party.
So there's this whole other political layer to this.
Absolutely.
This isn't just about foreign policy. It's a reflection of what's happening inside Croatia, politically.
Exactly. The election really brought to light this underlying dissatisfaction with the current government. Like voters are maybe looking for a change in direction or someone who will fight harder for their concerns.
It's interesting how this one election result can tell us so much about a country, both internally and externally.
Yeah, it's like a snapshot of, like you said, those internal and external tensions.
Okay, so we've got a president who's not afraid to shake things up, a population that's grappling with what it means to be part of the EU and NATO, and a political scene that's, well, ripe for change.
You got it.
What happens now?
Good question. What should we be watching for as Milanović starts his second term?
Yeah.
Well, for me, the big question is how his stance on the EU and NATO will actually play out.
Yeah.
Will he use his position to really push for those reforms? Will he try to find allies in other EU countries who share his skepticism?
And how's this all going to impact his relationship with Prime Minister Plenković?
Yeah.
Because those articles we read mentioned some, let's say, tension between them.
Oh, yeah, it's been pretty contentious. Public disagreements, accusations flying back and forth.
Yeah.
And, foreign policy and military matters fall under the president's authority. So I would be surprised if things heat up even more.
So more political battles on the horizon.
It's a real possibility.
Okay, so potential international implications, internal political showdowns, and a whole lot of unknowns. Sounds like things are about to get interesting in Croatia.
Definitely. And what's fascinating is that this isn't just about Croatia.
Oh.
It raises questions about the future of European integration as a whole. Like, what's the relationship between nations and these big international organizations? How's that all evolving in this changing world?
Okay, lots to think about there. But before we jump into those broader questions,
Sure.
let's take a closer look at these comparisons to Donald Trump.
Yes, let's do that.
Because it's an interesting parallel.
It is. Obviously, they come from different backgrounds, different contexts, but there are some similarities in their style.
Yeah.
And how they connect with certain voters.
So, give me an example. What are we talking about here?
Well, both of them are known for, that combative way of speaking.
Right.
They challenge the conventional wisdom and they tap into that populist sentiment.
So they appeal to voters who feel like the system's not working for them?
Exactly. Voters who are skeptical of traditional politicians and, looking for someone who will shake things up.
So it's not just about being outspoken or controversial for the sake of it.
No, it's deeper than that.
There's a connection with a certain type of voter who feels overlooked, maybe even ignored.
Exactly. They've both figured out how to tap into that sense of disillusionment.
Right. And they offer an alternative, even if it's unconventional or unpredictable.
That's it. And that's why these comparisons, even though they're not perfect, are worth examining. They help us understand these broader trends in politics today.
Okay, so we've got Milanović's unexpected victory. We've got the complex dynamics of Croatian politics.
Right.
And we've got this intriguing comparison to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
This deep dive is already proving to be super insightful.
We're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack, especially those broader questions you mentioned about the future of Europe and how power is shifting between nations and these big institutions.
Okay, well, let's dive into that next. Stay with us as we explore the ripple effects of this Croatian election on the world stage.
So as we're looking at the bigger picture here, it's worth asking, is this just a Croatian thing? Milanović's victory? Or could this be a sign of something bigger happening across Europe?
That's a really good question. I mean, the thought of more leaders like him popping up, it's kind of like those domino displays, where one tile sets off this whole chain reaction.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely this feeling that European politics are getting a lot more unpredictable.
Okay.
Fragmented. We're seeing this rise in populism.
Right.
Euroscepticism in different countries.
Yeah.
And leaders who are basically saying, hey, we're not playing by the old rules anymore, challenging those traditional power structures in the EU.
So what's different now? Why are these anti-establishment figures suddenly gaining traction?
Well, it's not just one thing, right? The whole bunch of factors all coming together.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. That global financial crisis a decade ago left a lot of people feeling really insecure economically and disillusioned with the folks in charge.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And then you throw in the pandemic,
Right.
the conflict in Ukraine. It just adds to the uncertainty, the anxiety. People start looking for strong leaders who promise those simple solutions to these really complex problems.
And those simple solutions often involve blaming someone else, like the EU or some other external force.
Oh, classic populist move. It's us versus them. They become the protectors against these outside threats.
It's funny, right? Because the EU was created to bring people together, prevent conflict.
Right.
And now, in some ways, it's becoming this source of division.
Yeah, that's the irony of it all. Integration can be great, but it also creates these tensions.
Okay.
Challenges national identities, interests.
Right.
And when times get tough, those tensions are ripe for exploitation.
So how should we view Milanović's skepticism then? Is he a real threat to the EU and NATO?
I think it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
I mean, his criticism of the EU, it comes from a place of, hey, this has become too bureaucratic, undemocratic, favors the big guys,
Okay.
At the expense of smaller countries like Croatia.
Yeah.
And his NATO skepticism. It's about not getting dragged into conflicts that don't directly benefit Croatia.
Right.
Like the war in Ukraine.
But Croatia still needs the EU for economic support.
Of course.
And NATO for security. Doesn't that create a contradiction?
It does. He's walking a tightrope. between asserting Croatian independence and keeping those relationships intact.
So how do you see this playing out? What are some possible scenarios here?
Well, one possibility is he uses his position to push for reform from within.
Okay.
Advocates for more transparency, accountability,
Right.
more level playing field in the EU and NATO.
Yeah.
He could try to build alliances with other countries that share his concerns.
So like a coalition of the skeptical within the EU.
Exactly. Another possibility is he takes a more pragmatic approach. Stays in those organizations,
Okay.
but pursues a more independent foreign policy. Maybe strengthens ties with countries that are also wary of the West, like Turkey, maybe some Asian countries.
That could definitely ruffle some feathers with Croatia's traditional allies.
It could. And then there's the possibility that it's all just talk,
Okay.
to appease his supporters back home,
Right.
without actually changing Croatia's course all that much.
So a lot of potential paths, but no clear answers yet.
Nope, and that's what makes this so fascinating. It touches on some really big questions facing Europe today. Questions about identity, sovereignty, security, and how international cooperation works in a world that's changing so rapidly.
Yeah, it's amazing how this one election focused on one country
Right.
opens up all these broader questions about the future of Europe.
It does, and it reminds us that it's not just about the headlines.
Uh-huh.
It's about understanding those deeper forces at play and how they shape everything around us.
Okay, so we talked a lot about those big picture questions,
Yeah.
but let's bring it back to Croatia for a minute.
Sure.
Knowing how strongly Milanović feels about the EU and NATO, how do you think this is going to affect his relationship with Prime Minister Plenković and just the political landscape within Croatia?
Well, like we said earlier, their relationship has been,
Yeah.
let's just say, not very smooth.
They haven't exactly been shy about disagreeing with each other publicly.
Not at all. And remember, foreign policy, military matters, that's all in the president's domain.
Oh.
So yeah, this is going to be a major source of friction between them.
So more gridlock, political battles. Are we headed down that road in Croatia?
It's definitely possible. Milanović's got this strong mandate now.
Yeah.
He's not really known for backing down, but Plenković and his HDZ party,
Uh-huh.
they still control parliament.
Okay.
They had a lot of influence on domestic policy.
So it's this power struggle, each leader with their own area of control.
Exactly. Can they find a way to work together on those big issues?
Right.
Or will their disagreements just make things more unstable?
And what about those domestic problems we talked about? The economy, corruption.
That's the key question. Croatia's got some real challenges that need attention.
Yeah.
If the president and prime minister are always at odds, it could paralyze the government. They won't be able to address those issues effectively.
So the stakes are pretty high, not just for Croatia's role in the world,
Right.
but for its own stability and well-being.
Exactly. This election has created a really complex situation with potential consequences on multiple levels.
It's a lot to take in, but I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Me too.
It's helping me connect the dots between what might seem like these isolated events
Yeah.
and those larger trends that are shaping things.
That's what makes this so interesting, right? It's not just about the headlines. It's about understanding those deeper forces at play.
Well said. Before we wrap up this part, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something. Throughout this conversation, you've talked about this disillusionment, this anxiety among some Croatians. What are some of the key things driving that? And how might that shape Croatian politics going forward?
That's a great question. It really gets to the heart of why someone like Milanović, with his views, could connect with voters the way he did. I think we need to start by recognizing that Croatia, like a lot of countries, has been through some major changes.
Right.
Going from communism to a market economy,
Yeah.
the wars in the 90s, joining the EU.
Yeah.
Those are huge events that reshape everything, socially, politically.
And those transitions don't always benefit everyone equally.
Exactly. Some people thrive, others struggle.
Right.
The gap between the rich and the poor gets wider.
Yeah.
Corruption's still an issue. A lot of people, especially younger generations, they're facing economic uncertainty, a lack of opportunity.
So it's that mix of economic anxiety
Right.
and the feeling that the system's not working for them.
Exactly. And that breeds resentment, distrust in the political elite. It creates this perfect environment for populist leaders who promise to shake things up, break from the status quo.
It's like this vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
The more disillusioned people get,
Yeah.
the more likely they are to embrace those simple solutions,
Right.
even if those solutions aren't realistic or could even be harmful in the long run.
That's the danger of populism. It feeds on that anger, that frustration, offering scapegoats, easy answers that appeal to emotions more than reason.
And in this case, the scapegoats are often the EU,
Yeah,
NATO, these external forces.
exactly. By pointing the finger outward, populist leaders can avoid taking responsibility, rally support around this nationalist agenda.
It's a powerful strategy.
It is.
But it doesn't actually fix the root of the problem.
That's the key. It might feel good for a while, like you're empowered, but it doesn't lead to real, lasting solutions. It can actually make things worse. You know, deeper divisions, harder to solve those complex problems that need everyone working together.
So what does all of this mean for Croatia's future?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
They're at a crossroads.
Okay.
Milanović victory. It's a clear sign that people want change. But what kind of change will it be? Will it benefit everyone? Or will it just empower a new elite, leaving those underlying problems untouched?
Those are big questions. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes right now.
No, it's a fascinating situation, but also really important to watch.
It is. It affects so much more than just Croatia.
Right.
It reflects those bigger trends, the challenges that democracies around the world are facing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This election has created a really complex and dynamic situation.
Yeah.
Potential repercussions on so many levels.
It's a lot to process, but I'm really glad we're doing this deep dive.
Right.
It's helping me see the connections between what seem like these isolated events and those bigger underlying trends.
That's what makes this so fascinating. It's not just about following the headlines. It's about understanding those deeper forces at play.
Well said. Before we wrap things up,
I
want to get your take on one more thing. We've talked about how this election highlights the sense of disillusionment, anxiety among some Croatians. What are some of the main factors driving that, and how could that shape Croatian politics going forward?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of why someone like Milanović, with his unconventional views, could resonate so strongly with voters. I think we have to start by acknowledging that Croatia, like many countries around the world, has gone through some pretty significant upheavals in recent decades. The transition from communism to a market economy, the wars in the 1990s, the process of joining the EU, these are all major events that have reshaped the social and political landscape.
And those transitions don't always benefit everyone equally.
Exactly. While some have thrived in this new environment, others have struggled to adapt. The gap between the rich and the poor has widened, corruption remains a concern, and many, especially young people, are facing economic uncertainty and a lack of opportunity.
So it's a combination of economic anxieties and a sense that the system isn't working for everyone.
Precisely. And these anxieties can fuel a sense of resentment and distrust towards the political elite, creating fertile ground for populist leaders who promise radical change and a break from the status quo.
It seems like a vicious cycle. The more disillusioned people become, the more likely they are to embrace those who offer simple solutions, even if those solutions are unrealistic or potentially harmful in the long run.
That's the danger of populism. It often thrives on exploiting those feelings of anger and frustration, offering scapegoats and easy answers that appeal to people's emotions rather than their reason.
And in this case, the scapegoats are often the EU, NATO, or other external forces.
Exactly. By blaming outside influences for internal problems, populist leaders can deflect responsibility and rally support around a nationalist agenda.
It's a powerful tactic, but it doesn't necessarily address the root causes of the discontent.
That's the key point. While this kind of rhetoric might provide a temporary sense of empowerment or catharsis, it doesn't necessarily lead to sustainable solutions. In fact, it can exacerbate divisions and make it even harder to address complex challenges that require cooperation and compromise.
So what does this mean for Croatia's future?
It's difficult to say for certain, but it's clear that the country is at a crossroads. Milanovic's victory represents a rejection of the status quo and a desire for change. But what kind of change will it be? Will it be a change that benefits all Croatians, or will it simply empower a new elite while leaving the underlying problems unresolved?
Those are weighty questions, and I don't envy the Croatian people as they grapple with them, but it's certainly a fascinating and important story to follow.
It is indeed, and it's a story that has implications far beyond Croatia's borders, as it reflects broader trends and challenges facing democracies around the world.
Okay, so we've looked at the global stage and those anxieties that are fueling this populist wave. But let's zoom back in on Croatia for a minute, specifically the power dynamics within the country. I mean, we know that Milanović and Prime Minister Plenković have, well, let's just say a spirited relationship.
Spirited is a good word for it. Their public clashes, the accusations, it's really become a defining feature of Croatian politics these days, almost like watching a political drama play out in real time.
Yeah, except with real consequences, right? How are they supposed to effectively run a country with this much animosity between them, especially with everything else Croatia's dealing with? The economy, those ongoing corruption scandals.
It's a valid concern. And it's not just about personality clashes, right?
Sure.
It's about the potential for gridlock, for instability that could really hinder Croatia's ability to actually address those issues.
Right.
Can they put their differences aside for the greater good? That's the big question.
Yeah, is that even possible, though? With their different personalities, political styles, you've got Milanović, the fiery populist, and then Plenković, more of a traditional establishment figure.
It's definitely a challenge. But their dynamic also presents maybe a unique opportunity. Think about it, this constant clash of viewpoints, this push and pull between opposing forces, it could actually lead to a more balanced approach to governing.
So instead of seeing it as dysfunction, it could actually be a kind of checks and balances system.
Exactly. It might not be pretty, but it could be effective. It forces both sides to constantly be in dialogue, to justify their positions, and to find compromises that actually work for a wider range of people.
It's like that old saying, iron sharpens iron, right?
Yeah.
Their clashes, maybe those are frustrating in the short term, but they could create a stronger, more resilient political system over time.
It's an intriguing possibility. It kind of challenges that idea that democracy is always about harmony and consensus. Maybe sometimes it's about embracing those disagreements and figuring out how to channel them into something productive.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It's not just about who wins or loses, it's about the process itself. That constant negotiation and adaptation, that's what keeps a democracy healthy.
Exactly. And maybe this specific dynamic, this tension between a populist president and a more establishment prime minister, it reflects those broader anxieties that are playing out not just in Croatia, but across Europe and even further afield.
Yeah, it's a reminder that democracy is messy, always changing, and, well, really fascinating to watch.
It is. And while we can't predict the future, we can definitely try to understand these complex issues, arm ourselves with the knowledge and the critical thinking skills to actually participate in shaping the future in our own communities and beyond.
Absolutely, and that's really what the deep dive is all about. We're not here to tell you what to think, but to give you the tools to form your own informed opinions.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the Croatian election, I really encourage our listeners to keep digging into these issues, to ask questions, stay curious about the world around them.
Couldn't agree more. This conversation has been incredibly insightful, and it's left me with even more questions than I started with. I'm definitely going to be following what happens next in Croatia.
I think we all will. The story is just getting started.
It is. And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder. Given everything we've learned about the challenges facing Croatia and those broader trends we've been talking about, what do you think this election means for the future of democracy, not just in Europe, but everywhere? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into the topics that matter. Stay curious and keep exploring.